don't miss the gravity that Jesus is saying this specifically to his people. He's saying, I have a few things against you. If I have something against you or you have something against me, we need to give that great pause. We need to consider that. We need to be sensitive to that. But when the King of Kings, when Jesus Almighty says, I have a few things against you, my friend, you should have no other option but to stop in your tracks and listen for what you need to change. And so he's saying it here to Pergamum. He says, I have a few things against you. And so he's going to give really two big examples. And at first glance, they may not make a lot of sense if you don't know the context of it, but I'll give a summation of it. He says, you have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to sacrifice or to place a stumbling block in front of the Israelites, to eat meat sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. If you're new to the Bible, maybe you're a new Christian, you may not understand or know the story of Balaam or Balak. So let me just sum it up for you. In the Old Testament, you had a king of Moab. His name was Balak, and they were direct enemies of Israel. Israel had been delivered from Egypt, and they were on their 40-year journey and going to the Promised Land. And so the king of Moab was scared of Israel. That was the bottom line, because he realized that the one true God, Yahweh's power, was with Israel. And so Balak, the evil king, he hires a prophet. Somehow this prophet had a connection to God in the past. I don't think he was an Israelite, but he had this connection of knowing and had been used by God to speak truth before. And so Balak hires this guy named Balaam to pronounce a curse against the nation of Israel. So Balak promises the world to this guy, like his payday was going to be huge. He was going to make big money if he would just give a curse over the nation of Israel. So Balaam thought he was going to go make his payday. He thought he was going to collect a big paycheck. And on the way to go curse Israel, he gets stopped by his own donkey. Anybody know that story? And it takes a donkey sometimes to get us back in the line. I won't go into that one. That's a good one. Sometimes a donkey's smarter than us. But anyway, after this donkey kind of gives him what for, he goes on, and Balak says, the king says, hey, if you will curse them, I'm going to give you a big payday. And Balaam at that point, because he's scared of who God is and what God has made clear, he says, listen, I want a big payday. I want to make the money, but I can't do any more than what God says. If God says one thing, I can't do another, because I've got to say what he says. And so anyway, he takes him to see one portion of Israel. They were in the big valley, and so Balaam's overlooking that, and they set up this big sacrifice. And so Balak's like waiting on him to give a curse over Israel, to curse them. And Balaam instead gives this amazing promise. And the king's like, what'd you just do? You just blessed them, and I told you to curse them. He says, I can't help it. Then the second time, he took him to another spot on another mountain and saw another portion of Israel. And he says, man, you got to curse them for me. He says, all right, I will, but I can only do what God says. And so he speaks these beautiful words of blessing over Israel. And the king at this point is like, God, you're killing me. I need you to curse Israel. And so a third time it happens, over and over. And Balaam says, hey, I can only do what God has made clear. So it seems like that's the end of the story. Let me give you a positive and let me give you a warning. If you have trusted in Jesus as your Lord and Savior, no matter what Satan tries to speak over you, you've been blessed by Jesus Christ. You have an eternal blessing from Jesus Christ. I'm not trying to preach a prosperity gospel to you, because life is tough here. Bad things are going to happen here on earth. But greater is he who's in you than he who's in the world. If you have repented and trusted Christ, Satan can't curse what God has blessed in your life. So let me make that part clear. But here's the flip side of it. Just a few days, a few weeks later, since Balaam says we couldn't beat him, we're going to join him. You know that, right? If you can't beat him, join him. So within a few weeks and a few months after that, they start bringing all the other people together with their false idols, and they start intermarrying, they start committing sexual immorality, they start worshiping these idols. Isn't it amazing that while God promised and declared a blessing even over someone that was trying to curse them, they fell into their own stumbling blocks? That God had blessed them, but they got tripped up by their own natural, earthly, fleshly desires. I think there's great application for you and me here today if you're a believer, that Christ has spoken forgiveness of sins and new life and victory over sin, that sin doesn't have to define or identify you anymore. But what do we keep doing as followers of Christ? We keep going back into those stumbling blocks that Christ has already given us victory over. And so with Balaam and Balak, so us as well. And so he says, listen, there's some of you in the church in Pergamum, you're falling into the stumbling blocks that Balaam gave. Even though God had blessed you, you're taking up the stumbling blocks of the world. You're sacrificing. You're living a sexually immoral life. You're eating the meat sacrificed to idols. And you're like, well, I don't eat any meat sacrificed to idols in 2024. Let me promise you, my friends, you're getting satisfaction and sustenance from things you're putting in a priority over Christ. And Jesus is telling us to stop. And then he goes on to the second one. So first, some hold to the teaching of Balaam. Remember, some held to Jesus. Some are holding on to Balaam and his teaching. And then in verse 15, here's another thing he has against them. In the same way, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. The Nicolaitans were a similar group while they weren't the same. They were a group that said, hey, you can believe on Jesus or say you believe and live however you want. You can live in sexual immorality. You can live in greed and pride, and you can be inappropriate in your lifestyle and have no integrity. You can do that and still believe on Jesus. Just live however you want. And the Nicolaitans were talking about a duplicitous lifestyle. And so Jesus says, listen, there's some that are holding on to Jesus. Some are holding on to Balaam and Balak, and some are holding on to this Nicolaitans view of life. So my friends, I want to ask you this. What are you holding on to?